Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This will be part one of our exploration of Chapter 11, the intersection between health and sexuality. As we move our way through this chapter, I think the biggest take-home message is, number one, that your health has a direct and reciprocal relationship with your sexuality. The healthier we are physically and emotionally, the greater the chances that we'll be having healthy sexual experiences and be satisfied with those experiences. And the reverse, the healthier our sexuality is, and the more satisfied we are with our sexuality, that has trickled down positive effects for physical and emotional well-being. So to start off, much of this chapter is kind of a long bullet list of ways in which our health can be challenged, whether it's due to injury or illness or substance abuse and use of chemicals, or the fact of having a mental illness or having to take medications for those illnesses, and how each of those different kinds of situations can have an impact on sexuality and sexual expression. So what we're going to explore in this chapter is the basic idea that your health, various health conditions, various health challenges can change your sexual functioning. And I think an important second take-home message is that health changes, health challenges may affect your sexual functioning, but in many, even I would argue most cases, these are challenges that can be met, and people's ability to function sexually and to have high levels of sexual satisfaction can actually be attained in many cases. In this chapter, we're going to look at a wide range of physical illnesses and disabilities that are related to sexual functioning, and it should be assumed that illness and disability are very common, which means that people in our culture who are struggling with their sexual function because of physical illnesses and disability, there are a lot of these people. So it's not an unusual occurrence. Unfortunately, it's not something that people often find themselves having a conversation about with their physicians and other health and mental health care providers. Your authors provide you with a definition of disability, and they're using the concept pretty broadly. They're not using it as a legal term, but they're using it, in a general sense. But a disability is a health condition that creates what they call functional deficits in acts of daily living. So things like being able to get dressed, being able to bathe, being able to do usual self-care and sanitary activities, such as using the bathroom, brushing one's teeth, being able to feed oneself, and you can broaden that list, being able to clean up, being able to feed your dog, being able to drive your car. So there are changes in functional abilities that enable people to take care of themselves in their own spaces and to kind of control their activities day in and day out. As I said earlier, disabilities are pretty common. Your textbook reports a statistic that 36 million adults, that means people over the age of 18, have reported that they have a chronic disability. So they have a chronic illness or health condition that means that they have significant functional deficits and they need assistance in performing activities of daily living. Having a disability or having multiple disabilities means that people will have to find ways to navigate, sometimes quite creatively, their sexual expression with a partner, and if they don't have a current partner, they might have to find creative ways to think about and then express their sexuality when they're dating and pursuing relationships, um, it's important to keep in mind that having a disability is only one aspect of a person's identity. So your authors mention intersecting identities. Your your status as a person with a particular disability is only one aspect of who you are. That intersects with your sexual orientation. It intersects with um, your your gender identity. It intersects with all of those other elements like your race and your ethnicity and your biological sex. All of those things interact and have cultural meaning. So it's important to understand the complexity of sexual expression as it relates to health status and disability status. Now, we're specifically going to look at a variety of ways in which health problems and disabilities can impact sexuality, and the approach your authors have taken is to sort of categorize different types of health challenges that people can face. And they've chosen these based on the fact that these are areas of health functioning and disability that tend to have the greatest or the most common sexual impacts for people who experience them. Um, so there are some illnesses, there are some disabilities that have clear and dramatic effects on sexuality. For example, having a brain injury that renders you unable to use portions of your body or to have normal social interactions that you would have had previously would obviously have a dramatic effect on your sexuality. An illness like prostate cancer, if it requires surgery to remove the prostate, may make it impossible or difficult for males to have an erection, or uh, having a very high level spinal cord injury can mean dramatic impacts on sexuality. Other conditions, other illnesses may have transient or less dramatic effects on sexuality. At least in our culture, we tend to wrap up our sense of sexuality into our broader sense of self-image and to our interpersonal relationships. When an illness enters in or a disability enters into that relationship, it means that we kind of have to take a step back and do some reassessment. What does this mean for who I am? If I'm the person with the illness or the disability, what does this mean for who I am separately? And what does it mean for who we are as a couple, for example, or as partners? Or what does it mean for me as a potential partner who's looking, who may be young or still single? And what does it mean to be a disabled person who is seeking a relationship? As a result, people with disabilities or chronic illnesses often report in surveys that they struggle with or that they're anxious about how their disability status will factually affect their actual ability to perform sexually or to experience sex in the ways that they've been taught are quote unquote normal. But they also worry about and struggle with how they are viewed by other people. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Some people with disabilities, unfortunately, especially people who are very dependent on others for their daily living tasks, report that they are subject to abuse and to sexual victimization. It's not unheard of, for example, to hear of people who live in assisted living situations, and that's not all people who are elderly or who have dementia. That's a very broad and complex population. Lots of people who are currently in what we used to call nursing homes are younger people, people with severe mental illnesses, or people with developmental disabilities, and even people who are on the autism spectrum who can't live independently. And sometimes, unfortunately, those people report that because their disability renders them in some ways more vulnerable, they report that they may be abused physically and emotionally, as well as being sexually victimized. People with chronic illnesses and disabilities, and this is based on not just anecdotal evidence, but also on survey research, many people assume, although this assumption tends to be modified if people know someone personally or if they themselves have a chronic illness or a disability. But people generally tend to see individuals with chronic illnesses and disabilities as not having the same kind of sexual needs or interests as other people, which is a completely wrong-headed assumption. You don't ditch your sexuality when you develop an illness or if you've had an illness or disability for your whole life. Sexuality remains an aspect of who people are, regardless of their illness status. And some people, unfortunately, they believe that if people with chronic illnesses and disabilities start to assert their sexuality, that they're doing something wrong. So, for example, there's still some attitude research that shows that public opinion of people, say, with Down syndrome, who want to date, who want to have sexual relationships and want to marry and have children, that they should be refused the ability to do so because of a variety of mistaken assumptions about the capacity for consent, the capacity for having mature relationships, and or the capacity to raise children with each other. I mentioned a little bit ago, it's unfortunate, but physicians and healthcare professionals may not be prepared or educated or trained to think about and then communicate with their patients about the sexual and sexuality issues that may arise as a result of their illnesses and disabilities. And that's unfortunate because for people with chronic conditions or disabilities, they often, they see their healthcare providers as a stabilizing force. They see them as experts, but there seems to be this one zone of life that is kind of off limits to them. So individuals report that if they have an open set of conversations with their physicians or other healthcare providers about their sexuality, that their degree of sexual satisfaction and their sense that they have the ability to express their sexuality fully or to the fullest extent they're physically able goes up. So healthcare providers and physicians have an important role to play here, if not by providing information themselves, by referring their patients out to professionals who are specifically trained to work with patients about specifically their challenges in sexual expression. Now, research has shown that lots of people with chronic illnesses and disabilities report that this impacts, the fact that they have chronic illnesses and disabilities impacts their self-concept, so the beliefs that they have about themselves and their body image. And for many people, they may internalize beliefs that are more broadly endorsed in the culture, that they are undesirable, asexual, unattractive. And if they internalize those beliefs, then when they look at themselves or think about themselves, they believe those things to be true. This doesn't happen in a vacuum. You don't start to think negative thoughts about yourself unless you've kind of had feedback from someone or from your culture at large that those beliefs are warranted. So, you can think about the fact that people with disabilities are woefully underrepresented in media, in the stories that we tell, and when they are represented, they're often tangential characters, and they are not presented as having full sexual lives on screen. In some cases, there have been some notable exceptions in recent films, but even in some of those, like the film Me Before You, the real struggle for that couple is the fact that the person who is quadriplegic sees no point in being alive now that his body has been so transformed. In other cases, you have it, images of people with chronic disabilities who face abuse, who face neglect, which can happen in real life. But the fact is that in media representations, what we tend to see is either asexual disabled people or people with disabilities who are taken advantage of and brutalized, or if it's in a school context, they're made fun of. In many cases, people with disabilities are cast into dramas and comedies in sidekick kind of roles, providing comic relief, or they're presented as being super smart and really nerdy, and therefore indispensable to a team of crime fighters. So those are cultural messages that tend to suggest that if you have a disability or a chronic illness, you really are not a sexual being. You shouldn't have relationships because you can't be fulfilling to other people. So people may internalize those sort of cultural standards that you are an inadequate romantic partner. Something would have to be wrong with someone who is attracted to you, and they're probably going to hurt and take advantage of you anyway. Internalizing these negative social attitudes can lead people to believe that they shouldn't have intimate relationships, that they are incapable of them, that they will fail. And sometimes, unfortunately, parents of children, go back to the example of people with Down syndrome, many people with Down syndrome report that their parents and caregivers are resistant, very resistant to their becoming involved in intimate relationships. And for many of these young adults and adults who have Down syndrome, they argue that being independent, having intimate relationships are part of growing up, and just because they have Down syndrome, that should not be excluded from their experience. But many times parents are very hesitant, they're very anxious, they're very concerned that their child will be taken advantage of, or that they will make colossally bad decisions, like maybe they don't understand consent, maybe they will hurt someone, maybe they will get pregnant or get their partner pregnant unexpectedly and won't be able to cope with the consequences. So if people internalize those ideas that they are incompetent sexual decision makers, that they shouldn't have intimate relationships, they may in fact build an entire self-concept around that limitation and simply say to themselves, that is not a part of human experience that I'm allowed to have. So as a result, people may come to view themselves as being incomplete, inadequate, flawed, and unattractive to others. Now, it's entirely possible for an individual who has a disability and is not capable of having sex in the traditional sense that they would therefore have to adjust and change their sexual identity or aspects of their sexual self-concept. So I'm not saying that there wouldn't have to be accommodations and adaptations, but what I'm saying is that if you internalize stereotypes that are broad sweeping and don't take individuality into account, you will be sort of assuming that certain kinds of people should have sexual lives and certain people should not. And for far too often in our culture, we've assumed that people with disabilities should give up their sexual expression. Now, I found this website a couple years ago. There was a campaign I believe it was in the UK, but you'd have to fact check me on this. A photographer and a magazine, they decided, you know what, we're gonna do, they called it undressing disability, and they shot a lot of photos of people who had both visible and invisible disabilities. So you had some people who you could tell their physicality was quite different. Maybe someone in a wheelchair, or someone with cerebral palsy, or someone with another physical difference, like being an amputee. But then there were people who look physically quite typical, but have conditions like MS or other invisible conditions that certainly do qualify as disabling, like rheumatoid arthritis or lupus, for example. And it was a very interesting set of conversations that were stimulated by that photo spread. It really forced people to look at bodies and to look at the differences in bodies, but to reconceptualize those differences as beautiful instead of being freakish or something that would disgust you. Spinal cord injuries are certainly one source of debilitating injury that can change sexual experience and sexual expression. I think we talked about this in class at one point. Someone raised this as a discussion item. There are different kinds of spinal cord injuries. They can have very different levels of severity and very different outcome trajectories, meaning some injuries may be quite profound at the very beginning, but over a period of time, people improve and even improve substantially depending on the nature of the injury. Some injuries to the spinal cord are complete, meaning there's a complete severing of the spinal cord, as opposed to incomplete injuries where there either may be impingement or partial tearing or other kinds of damage, but not a complete severing of the spinal cord. The difference between those broad categories, in complete injuries, generally speaking, you're going to have more consequences for sexual functioning than in the case of incomplete injuries, but it really, really depends on the individual nature of the injury that a person has. Depending on where the injury is in the spinal column, you can either have expressions of paraplegia or quadriplegia, paraplegia being, it's often kind of talked about as paralyzed from the waist down, was how it was referred to when I was younger, but basically refers to the legs not being functional, whereas quadriplegia, you have involvement of the arms, of all four limbs. And even within those categories, you can have tremendous variability in terms of how much disability there is, whether the person is completely unable to use anything below the level of the neck, and that could include actually involvement of the diaphragm and needing to have assistance to breathe, or a person with paraplegia who has partial functioning even of their lower limbs, but they still are, at least in part, paraplegic. Now, regaining sexual function and being able to feel confident and positive about sexuality after a spinal cord injury can be a challenge. Most rehabilitation programs now do include information and attention given to sexuality, and that includes not just talking to the person who has experienced the injury, but also to their partner, so that they can be involved in kind of developing strategies to manage the physical side, but also how to manage the emotional aspects of adjusting to life with a spinal cord injury in general, but then also adjusting one's sexual self-concept and their sexual repertoire to that situation. As a result, rehabilitation programs may include peer support, specific training in masturbation, and while that sounds really weird on the surface, it is a direct part of teaching people how to reacquaint themselves with a body that is now changed. So it is seen as critically important. The internet has become involved in helping people with spinal cord injuries to meet new partners. Just as there are very tailored dating sites for people who are farmers, there's a whole dating site for that. There are dating sites for people with specific kinds of disabilities, including spinal cord injuries. And the internet has also been involved in helping people to communicate with each other specifically about their issues related to intimacy and to sexual expression. Many of the programs, I think I mentioned this before, do involve, if you have a person who's already in a relationship, working with both the person with the injury and their family to help them adjust and deal with the changes that have now taken place in their lives. And that includes Partners can sometimes become full-time caregivers or part-time caregivers. Regardless, they have to learn a lot about their partner's body that they probably didn't know before. And that can have impacts for intimacy. It can have impacts for the dynamics within the relationship. So going into that without support and the help of therapists who are trained to deal with those issues, it can make those relationships somewhat fragile. Now, in spinal cord injuries, it's often assumed that once you have a spinal cord injury, that there is no more sexual experience, that orgasms can't be achieved, and that's not usually the case, or it's not always the case. Orgasm can be attained for many people with spinal cord injuries, either through direct stimulation of the genitals, and that's the case for both males and females. I won't go into elaborate description of the anatomy and physiology of that, but in some cases, especially in cases of incomplete severing of the spinal cord, but even sometimes when you have complete severing, people can still be able, through direct stimulation of their genitals, to achieve orgasm. Now, obviously, there are differences in what is sensed. So the part of the body that you are able to feel having that orgasm experience may shift and change. But, orgasm is a whole body experience. So just because you don't have sensation from the genitals any longer doesn't mean that you won't experience other aspects of orgasm in the parts of the body that remain sensory or sensitive, rather. Since people with spinal cord injuries may experience incontinence, that's something that is often a concern that people with spinal cord injuries and their partners may have. So partners have to learn how to navigate that, how to, let's say a person has a colostomy bag or a urinary catheter. That's something you have to navigate if you're going to have sexual interactions. And that means you have to learn the technologies. You have to learn what kind of things are permissible, what things are not, what behaviors are going to create problems or introduce infectious agents in those situations. So that's something that people can be coached on and taught how to navigate with their partner. For men, some men are capable of having erections. So in that case, a partner can engage with them fairly directly by being seated on the penis. For men, though, with spinal cord injuries who cannot attain spontaneous injections, there are, in some cases, Viagra can be used to attain an erection, or a penile implant can be used in order to create an erection for a partner to then experience. Parents, so if we're talking about people who are capable of having children with a spinal cord injury, that's another area that is often kind of dismissed. Many people have the stereotype in mind that if you have a spinal cord injury, you really don't have any business having children because you can't take care of them. And those are really hostile, harsh attitudes to have. Many people with spinal cord injuries still want to have children and want to have families, and they argue that they have the right to do that. They will parent in some ways differently, but they're not impaired in their ability to love and to raise children. So while they may be able to have children physically, there are stressors for them that may be caused by the fact of their disability. And it may be challenging for them in terms of sexual dysfunction as well. Multiple sclerosis is another condition that can have impacts for people's sexual experiences. Multiple sclerosis is a progressive neurological condition. It attacks the central nervous system. It usually starts in between the 20s and the 40s. It's a fair amount more common in women than men. It can take a number of different forms. It's not the purpose of this class to go into detail about those various differences, but what people have is losses of muscle coordination, experience of weakness and fatigue, spasms, tremors, stiffness, in some cases bladder and bowel dysfunction, in many cases loss of sensation in the genital areas. So obviously there you're going to see impacts in terms of sexual experience, pain and numbness in various areas of the body, and sometimes cognitive impairments like loss of memory and problem-solving capacities. Depression is also quite common in multiple sclerosis. Sexual dysfunction is commonly reported among people with multiple sclerosis, and since you have 3 times a higher rate in women than in men, most of the research has been on women, and a little bit less of that research has been on men. But what women tend to report is loss of sensation, pain, vaginal dryness, loss of sexual drive. For men, difficulty attaining ejaculation, and for women, difficulty reaching orgasm have been reported. And it's kind of hard to drill down to the exact causes of these things. It's likely a complicated interaction between the physical changes driven by the neurological condition itself and the psychological aspects of multiple sclerosis, cognitive functioning, emotional functioning, and so on. People report improvement if they do counseling and occupational therapy, if they work on their communication skills, if they are open and communicative with their partners and their healthcare providers, they tend to report better outcomes for them. Now, I've included a link. I posted this link on D2L for you as well. It's a much more in-depth kind of description of the kinds of sexual problems that women with MS may report. And it's a useful description. So if you know someone or you're just interested in MS, that's a useful website to go to. And again, I posted that link for you on D2L. Cerebral palsy is another neurological type of condition, although it can be caused by a number of different things. It's often caused by damage to the brain, whether it's lack of oxygen or other kinds of damage that occurs before birth or during the birth process or early in infancy. And that damage to the brain causes some wide-ranging problems in terms of muscle spasticity, so there's impairment in muscle functioning, and there's sometimes problems in speech, and you can have the additional issue of a variety of different kinds of learning disabilities dependent on the level of severity of the damage to the brain and the sort of comprehensiveness of that damage. Some of the kinds of symptoms that people with cerebral palsy deal with are uncontrollable spasms or movements, so involuntary movements of the body, coordination problems, muscle spasms that can sometimes be quite painful, or at the very least can limit movement and the ability to move around. There can be speech problems because the muscle dysfunction can impair the speech production system. Some people report problems with their vision and their hearing, as well as some cognitive impairments. It's entirely likely, though, that people with cerebral palsy can have completely intact intellect and cognitive functioning, but their problems are strictly physical. So in terms of their ability to locomote, their ability to control their own movements, to walk unaided, and so on, may be impaired. However, cerebral palsy may come in people who also have developmental disabilities or other kinds of neurological conditions. Counseling often involves, as people age and are living longer and healthier lives with cerebral palsy, counseling and assistance should include, and is more likely to include today than in the past, helping people to, as they move into adulthood, to achieve sexual satisfaction in whatever form their physical body enables them to have. In some cases, that can be quite elaborate. I think I mentioned in class a YouTube video that I found where they were documenting the story of a couple, and the couple, both of them had cerebral palsy, and for both, their limitations in terms of their ability to move unaided was pretty limited, but they wanted to share a sexual experience with one another. They had to have the assistance of other people to make this happen so that they could have actual intercourse in their intimate lives. So for them, the solution was fairly elaborate. For other people with cerebral palsy, it's a handful of adaptations and adjustments, and counseling and in some cases coaching can help people to find the level of sexual satisfaction that they desire to have. Diabetes, it may not, you probably know several people in your life who have diabetes, but you may not have thought that there could be sexual consequences of diabetes. There are multiple forms of diabetes, sometimes with childhood onset, sometimes with adulthood onset. For some people, their diabetes is quite severe and has wide-ranging effects on them. For other people, it's quite manageable and has mild, if any, effects for them in terms of their sexual functioning. That said, diabetes is a chronic disease of the pancreas. The pancreas doesn't produce enough insulin, and there are a variety of medical means for making up for that insufficiency. In some cases, you have people who need to adjust their diet and very carefully adjust their lifestyle so that they are capable of maximizing the insulin that they do produce. In other cases, their pancreas is completely failed, so they have to supply insulin from the outside, either through injections or through a pump that calibrates the level of insulin that they need. Regardless, there are some health consequences, particularly of untreated or poorly regulated diabetes. For men, long-term chronic diabetes, again, particularly if it's untreated or poorly regulated, can result in people having reduced levels of testosterone, which may themselves have effects on ejaculation and orgasm, or retrograde orgasm, which is where the ejaculate kind of backs up into the bladder. And these are individuals who may be more vulnerable to Peyronie's disease, which we talked about in the chapter on anatomy. For women, and again, these are more likely outcomes if you're talking about untreated or poorly regulated diabetes. You can have losses of lubrication, difficulties achieving orgasm, and increased risk for yeast infections because you're changing sort of the environment, the chemical, the biological environment of the vaginal canal. That's a common kind of side effect of having diabetes. Even for people who are well treated and well regulated, they may still, women in particular, may still report lower lubrication and an increased risk of yeast infections as a result of diabetes. For many of you, you have grandparents who are in this vulnerable range for developing dementia. I know I've talked to a couple people in class who have grandparents who have Alzheimer's or have passed away because of Alzheimer's. And I think a couple of you in class talked about working in assisted living or nursing care types of facilities. So you've given a little bit of thought to this. Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia, and there's a wide list of dementias out there. involve various forms of impaired cognitive functioning, changes in memory and language, changes in learning capacity, attention, and confusion. The ability to hold on to tasks or to hold on to conversations may be impaired. The term dementia should be considered a broad one. Alzheimer's disease is an example of a dementia type condition. So when we talk about dementia broadly, we're talking about a brain disorder that involves a wide range of cognitive problems. And your authors list these cognitive problems. So changes in memory, often the first sign that someone is developing dementia is changes in their short-term or working memory. Aphasias, agnosias, apraxias, those are language production and language processing problems. Changes in the ability to think abstractly and to plan, or to keep moving through a plan and finish a plan. For example, I forget where I read this, but I remember the example. It was someone describing a loved one, and I can't remember if it was someone I actually knew or something that I saw on a documentary. But they were saying one of the first things that made them realize that their loved one was in real trouble was when they stopped in the middle of making coffee and they couldn't remember how to finish. So part of that was memory, but it was also not being able to follow through on a plan and then remember the steps and finish the plan. Sometimes this person said that they would get in the middle of making coffee and then get distracted and start doing something else, or they would be making coffee and then forget where the coffee grounds were, where the can was, or forget how to use the buttons to make the coffee maker work. Alzheimer's disease, as I said, is a specific form of degenerative brain disease that starts with some mild forms of memory loss. Then the impairments get more severe. Eventually, you may have aspects of severe memory losses, inability to manage everyday activities, impairments in being able to dress, to eat, to bathe, to walk. It's an ugly disease as it progresses, robbing people of their individuality and their emotions and their memories. All of the dementias, and Alzheimer's is no exception, there are obvious sexual consequences and issues, and they become complicated. I know we talked in class about how nursing care facilities, they have to have policies and procedures in place for sexual encounters that take place between residents. And in some cases, these are sexual encounters that take place between residents who have varying levels of dementia, including Alzheimer's. For the staff, that becomes challenging because you're dealing with people who have varying, often day-to-day varying levels of ability to consent. Since these are brain dysfunctions, in some cases you can have dementias that involve frontal lobe changes, that involve dysregulated behavior. People can become aggressive, and in some cases they can become sexually aggressive. That's not typical of Alzheimer's disease, but in some cases in Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia, you can see people who become quite disinhibited. They become more sexualized in their speech, kind of saying those unfiltered thoughts that just fly into their heads. So there are a lot of ways in which you have to think about this. Another way to think about sexuality with Alzheimer's and dementia is with married couples or long-term cohabiting couples. If one of the partnership has developed a dementia condition, how does the other partner navigate sexual relationships with, or sexual interactions with, their now ill partner? And counselors talk about having to work with the families of people with dementia and help them to kind of navigate the change, because the change kind of marches steadily on, and at some point people often have to ask themselves, at what point is my wanting to have sex with my husband or wife, at what point is my husband or wife not able to authentically respond any longer? And what are some things that I need to think about in terms of how to navigate that change? So in some cases, counseling is not just for people with the neurological condition, but also for their surviving family members, and people who were previously engaged in sexual interactions with them. Finally, traumatic brain injury. We've talked about several neurological conditions here. Traumatic brain injury is something that researchers have been kind of forced to give a much higher priority to, especially given the fact that we have had military service personnel deployed in war zones that have a high degree of likelihood of producing traumatic brain injuries. That's kind of stepped up the necessity for investigation into the broader effects of traumatic brain injury, the treatment approaches for these injuries, and what kind of services need to be provided. So traumatic brain injury, as you probably already know, is any kind of insult to the brain. It can be caused by an external force, like your head striking another hard surface. It can be caused by gunfire. It can be caused by other projectiles. It can also be caused by sudden forceful movement, like, say, a wide receiver being tackled and slammed to the ground, or a quarterback similarly being slammed by a 300-pound lineman and then tossed to the ground, or a soccer player who heads the ball too much, or a lacrosse player who gets hit and spins, and while they're spinning, they're falling, and then they strike the ground. So there are lots of ways that people get traumatic brain injuries. One that you may not have thought of, all of those military service personnel who carry around their large guns. When they shoot those guns are quite loud, and there has been research recently that shows that engaging those weapons without proper hearing protection can cause traumatic brain injury. So, and also speaking of military veterans, the fact of roadside bombs, shoulder projected bombs, other kinds of bombs, that increases the likelihood that our military veterans are coming home not having just one traumatic brain injury, but having a cascade of them. So there are lots of ways that people can develop a traumatic brain injury. They vary from extremely mild and transitory to very severe and permanent forms of damage, and everything in between. Any of you who've had a concussion, I'm one of those people. I've had at least two, probably more. But at least two that I know for sure were concussions. If you've had a concussion, even a mild one, you have had a traumatic brain injury. You probably know people who've had severe brain injuries, perhaps due to a stroke or a car accident or whatever other kind of traumatic insult to the brain. All of those are TBIs. Now, for sex and sexuality, there can be direct effects, there can be indirect effects, and it really depends on the nature of the injury, the severity of the injury, and the locations in the brain that have been impacted specifically. There are some injuries, for example, that directly hit areas of the brain that are heavily involved in emotion and arousal. And if that's the case, that person may then experience deficits in arousal and deficits in sex drive, or the reverse, extremely heightened sex drive and arousal states, depending on, again, the nature of the injury. Frontal lobe, so the big frontal area, which is largely responsible for higher order functioning, planning, logic, discriminating, making careful thoughts that allow you to sort things from one another. Frontal lobe dysfunction can have personality effects. It can change how people are attracted, what they're attracted to, the level of their arousal, how they choose to act out that arousal can shift. In some cases, when people have a pretty dramatic frontal lobe injury, it can really alter their personality and how they present themselves to the world. Um, Even though their injury may not have appeared to be particularly profound, if the injury was diffuse and involved a lot of frontal lobe interaction, that's an individual who may experience those kinds of pretty profound changes. So some of the things that you could see are either increases or dramatic decreases in sex drive and the ability to express self-control. In some cases, for men, you see changes in erectile ability, again, depending on where the injury was. So if the areas of the brain that are part of that neurological system that's responsible for erection, if that is damaged in some way or interfered with in some way, you can have decreased erections. Some people report difficulty becoming aroused. Sometimes that's because of emotional dysregulation, which is a common symptom of TBI. Other times it's because of specific injuries to specific areas of the brain. Some people report changes in their ability to reach orgasm. Again, that it's hard to predict exactly why that would happen or why, where, which particular area of the brain would be responsible for that, but it is something that people report. In some cases, I wouldn't say that this is common, but it has been reported in the literature. In some cases of traumatic brain injury, people will develop unusual for them new sexual interests. Like I think this was in one of Oliver Sacks's essays. He reported a story of a man who suddenly became both sexually and otherwise obsessed with hats after a stroke. So that's an extreme example. Others have reported new sexual interest in other kinds of arousal, maybe a new fetish, a new interest in oral sex or in feet. Who knows? I mean, most of these are changes in that are fetishistic, but not always. In some cases, it can be just a shift in arousal object. People have been reported to see shifts in, what kinds of people they're attracted to. And again, it's just dependent on the nature of the injury itself. Many people with TBI, especially when there's frontal lobe involvement, or when there's involvement to some of the systems within the brain that are responsible for emotional regulation, will report some pretty profound changes in their social interaction abilities. So they experience changes in mood, sometimes mood dysregulation, where their moods tend to shift rapidly and they don't feel like they have a lot of control over them. The experience of depression that can be long and intractable, and their reaction to that may be to socially withdraw and to experience bouts of anger control difficulties. So part of the emotional dysregulation piece that is often found in TBI cases has a lot to do with, part of your executive functioning in the frontal lobe is being able to say, okay, my lower brain system that tells me here's the emotion, here's the arousal state, here's the emotion. The frontal lobe has to do the interpretation and make sense of that arousal state and give you language to describe it. Well, in the case of frontal lobe injuries, that filtering process is impaired. So you may have these unfiltered, uninterpreted arousal states, and that can cause what we call emotional dysregulation. So those are things that would obviously interfere with relationships. If you have a person who's emotionally dysregulated, has limited capacity for controlling, say, anger, it may result in impaired relationships and even situations where a person's partner may feel threatened or in danger. So approaches to treatment often involve helping people become more aware of what kinds of effects their TBI could have, and then working in various forms of therapy, both in physical therapy and occupational therapy, to help people to attain higher levels of functioning. Some of that involves, if you're early on into the injury process, of really working hard to retrain the brain and retrain the uninjured areas to take over the functions of the injured areas so that people can recover some of the balance that they had previously. So again, same messages with some of our other neurological conditions. Having the support of a well-educated and well-trained team of professionals and paraprofessionals would seem to be essential for helping people with brain injuries and those that they love adjust and adapt. So that's the end of part 1 of our chapter. We'll pick up here next time. I'll see you soon.